Hi everyone. Thanks for watching my short little presentation, which I'm calling Carbon Accounting Game Dev, which is a first snapshot of the carbon emissions attributable to game development as an activity. So this project is part of a larger book project I'm kind of in the final stages of wrapping up. Digital Games After Climate Change is hopefully going to be out next year through Palgrave. And what I do in that book is I look at what role games can play in addressing climate change, what a green game might look like, and then I go into some of the detail of emissions intensity associated with game development activity, distribution, and play, the play of players at the end. And then I also talk about the half-life or the end life of gaming devices, the kind of material that goes into them, what kind of effect they have on the landscape, both being mined in the first instance and then being disposed of, and what we might need to do to achieve a carbon neutral games industry. And so because I don't have a picture of or I don't have a live video of me going as well at the same time, I thought, there you go, there's a bit of context for me. I'm a researcher at the moment at the University of Technology, Sydney. I'm actually wrapping up there on December 10th and moving on to other things, leaving academia after that. So this is my kind of final research project. So as part of the data gathering for the book, I released a survey at the start of this year to gather some information from developers directly, to ask them about their energy usage and, if they have it, their emissions intensity, as well as general questions about their level of concern with or about the issue of climate change and how important they think it is to kind of take action in the games industry. And in this presentation, I'm just reporting on the kind of quantitative data. So I got some self-reported energy usage figures from. I got a broad range of data, but I got about 30 responses. Not a huge response, but the useful data, I got about 3 solo developers telling me their energy usage, their emissions intensity, or I kind of estimated their intensity of emissions based on that kind of energy usage. I got 1 studio of 2 to 5 people in Hobart telling me what or how much energy they used. 6 to 10 people in 6 to 10 person studio in Perth. 1 large studio of 50 to 100 people in Sydney that I also went and spoke to and interviewed and talked to them about their kind of process and where they are on their kind of emissions and decarbonisation journey. And then 1 studio from London with 100 to 250 people. And I'll come back to some of the findings of what the data shows in a second, but that was the data that I gathered, and a lot of this is kind of isn't really available to kind of anyone else. The exception being the 100 to 250 person studio, which was Space Ape Games in London, and they actually published their very, very detailed spreadsheet of how they managed their kind of to go carbon neutral or carbon negative even. So I'll come back to that. The second part of the project involved gathering emissions and energy usage data from the corporate social responsibility reports of a number of large publicly traded companies. And this is an increasing trend we're seeing in kind of corporate reporting. So I got data from the company Rovio, which makes Angry Birds, from Nintendo, surprisingly, given some of their kind of environmental history. If you'll remember back to, say, 2010-ish, Greenpeace was very critical of Nintendo and ranked them as one of the worst offenders of a number of technology companies in terms of transparency of their supply chain, but also the sourcing of materials and things like that. Ubisoft as well publish their data, and Sony as well have some kind of hard figures on their entire business. So that's not just the games divisions, and in fact, they don't break it down in enough detail to be clear which or how much is games specifically. But there is actually a growing amount of data out there of self-reported kind of energy use and emissions from large game developers, which is exciting to see. So in a second, I'll present a table and just kind of talk about some of the data points in it as the kind of results that I've gathered from both my survey and this kind of like data gathering from reports. But before I do that, a couple of caveats. Excuse me. Firstly, the data represents primarily Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, this is a greenhouse gas protocol reporting standard where it's only the fuel that the company itself uses, either on site or say in company cars, or it's fuel that has been burned, consumed somewhere else at a power generation site. So, like a grid level coal-fired power station, or I don't know, a gas turbine, whatever it is. So these are just Scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is the kind of standard for the most directly responsible emissions that a company is most directly responsible for. Two companies also included estimates for their downstream or Scope 3 emissions, which is emissions that are made by like the end consumer, basically, of the company's products. So in this case, that's the players themselves. And I haven't included that on this table because that very quickly gets very, very complicated. I mean, all of this, it should be said, is extremely complicated. Even getting it to this level of semi-clarity has been a real challenge. But the Scope 3 emissions are obviously a huge order of magnitude larger because there are millions of players, millions of consoles out there in the world, and it just completely dwarfs the kind of game development side of emissions. But nevertheless, it's important because it all kind of adds up. So here's the table that I have produced, which lists the kind of findings of the two data sets that I've kind of combined. So the top half, so the studios are ranked by size. So the smallest is at the top and the largest is at the bottom. With Sony being the kind of strange exception there, in that it's not just games, it's the whole division. So that's manufacturing. It's the Sony Movie Pictures division as well, all this other stuff. But what we've got is a breakdown by employee number, the annual kilowatt hours of energy used, and kilowatt hours is a fairly standard. That's the fairly standard unit of measurement of energy used, electrical energy used. In the UK as well, gas is used in some places, I guess, for heating. And weirdly enough, they also measure that in kilowatt hours. I don't know how that's converted, but helpfully, it's all the same kind of standard. So by gathering, and my survey asked, what was the most recent bill, that you received, or what, how much did you use in the most recent month? So for the first, or for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 respondents, they were all from my survey. And all of them kind of responded in sort of for the December-January area, or the December-January months, which in Australia is the hottest time of the year, so probably that's at the upper end of kind of energy usage seasonally. So I just averaged that, so it's maybe a little high, but, so we've got a range of figures here. I'll let you kind of pause the video and have a look at them and dig into them if you want. The main takeaway, though, is that on what I've done in the next column is I've taken the figures for the CO2 emissions associated with a particular kilowatt hour of energy for the location of the studio. So Brisbane has a slightly different kind of emissions factor to, say, Melbourne, Victoria, and again, it's a different emissions factor to Seattle in USA. The next column is about what kind of information we have about whether there's any kind of renewable mix in their kind of use. And interestingly enough, like a lot of the companies reported themselves that they are already kind of offsetting. And I suppose in a way this is not that surprising because these are the ones who are telling us the good news. They're happy to kind of share that they've actually been doing things to reduce their emissions. The other companies like EA doesn't offer any kind of actual hard data about how much energy it used or its kind of emissions. It just says, oh yeah, we're committed to reducing our emissions, and that's about it. Very, very unhelpful report. Whereas Ubisoft provides a figure of 66% of their overall kilowatt hours of energy used being from renewable sources, which is actually pretty impressive. And Nintendo as well is up to 98% renewable, which is I think like when I read that, I could barely believe it. That seemed kind of shocking to me that Nintendo is actually mostly renewable. But what's worth keeping in mind there is that this is corporate Nintendo. So this is like studios, this is developers, this is the publishing arm of Nintendo. There are huge parts of the Nintendo business that are not technically within the Nintendo corporate umbrella in terms of emissions reporting. So there's things like data centers, there's things like manufacturing, and all of those things will be contracted out to third-party companies. And so they don't have to kind of report on those emissions. But some of the reports have kind of mentioned things in passing, like Rovio, for instance, has said in their report that what did they say? They said data centers are a really big part of their kind of emissions totals, and they are moving towards preferring data centers that are renewable. So not a firm commitment, but it's something. And so then what we've tallied up is a figure of kilowatt hours per annum per capita. So that's units of energy used per employee per year. And then there's an associated figure. The top half of them are ones that I've kind of generated based on the kind of local energy intensity that I can kind of figure out based on the state in Australia that it's from, or whether it's wherever I can find data. And then the bottom half are usually like self-reported figures. So Rovio, Nintendo, Ubisoft, they all reported this CO2 tons per annum per employee figure themselves. So we can already see a big range in the amount of or in the intensity of game development activity from the very, very small lower end of the scale where it's like 0.04 tons per employee per annum. That's the Western Australian studio, which seems quite surprising. All the way up to, and I guess ignore Sony for a minute because that's not really representative of the rest of game dev. But at the top end, we might see something like 3 or 4 as the kind of, or even 5 as the figure. And I'd be willing to go up to 5 as a kind of like rough estimate for 5 tons of CO2 per employee as a kind of baseline, even though a lot of these figures are under that, because hardly any of these figures actually include a really huge component, which is international flights and travel. And Rovio is one of the few that does include that in it. And as soon as they include it, it basically doubles. It doubles their CO2 per employee per annum figure. So yeah, I think that's a sort of safe bet. So we'll come back to that. And this is just the kind of range that we get, again, breaking down the kind of spread. So the spread is somewhere between 0 and 5. Another thing to note as well is that the solo developers are reporting their figures based on usually like home consumption. So this is like, where they live. And so their figures are kind of aggregated with their household data. So those numbers are probably too high for them. And that includes like, all their other living energy use and stuff. So that's not all going to be attributable to game development activity. And so that's why we see this sort of dip in the middle, and then the kind of growth again at there's not really a clear line of best fit. It's sort of all over the place, which maybe gives a sense of the kind of ranges of intensity involved. And yeah, so I'm estimating a rough emissions factor between 1 and 5 is fairly reasonable. Now, if we take a figure from 2017 of maybe 17 million game developers full-time around the world, that gives us a very quite scary figure for the carbon emissions attributable to game development. I mean, it's just very simple maths, but we end up with 85 million tons of CO2 as a rough estimate. And this is a very kind of early it could be out by an order of magnitude either way, I think. I think that's probably safe to say. So it could be as low as 8.5 million or as high as 850 million, although that's probably too much. But yeah, at probably the upper end of the estimate at around 85 million CO2 tons emitted per annum, which is about the same carbon footprint as the country of Bangladesh, and puts it somewhere around the 50 to 70 mark in terms of countries of the world, I think, in terms of most emissions intense. Yeah, just as a bit of trivia. So some implications from the survey are that, well, first of all, it's really impossible to disaggregate the data of solo developers who work from home, and that makes the measuring of solo development and its kind of emissions intensity quite difficult. And we know as well from things like the GDC State of the Industry survey that there is a huge number of solo developers or small team developers mostly working from home. So getting an accurate picture of that end of the game development industry spectrum is going to be really hard. I also had a lot of qualitative responses suggesting real concern exists among game developers about climate change. And I think we're starting to see that be reflected in the kind of industry organizations like the Playing for Planet Alliance, the IGDA Climate SIG, and there's a really quite active climate games Discord, which if anyone's interested in, you can get involved in as well. From the corporate social responsibility data, the main implications I think here are that it's sort of exciting that many corporations are starting to do offsetting and purchase offsets, carbon offsets. So again, probably that 885 million tons figure is a little bit high because some of that is being offset, and some of that is actually renewable, I think, as well. So some of the, again, it's hard to say. These are sort of estimates. We're talking really big picture, very rough, not very granular. But yeah, the other thing about it, offsets too, is that doesn't mean no emissions. Offsets just mean that the emissions happen and then they're presumably taken out of the atmosphere later at some other stage, which at some point is not going to be enough, I think. We really need to start focusing on actually reducing emissions in the first place. Corporate social responsibility reporting is a really rich data set for sustainability researchers, particularly in the games industry. This is an area of, I think, real growth in kind of corporate social awareness. Lots of companies have now set carbon emissions targets. Microsoft has one. I didn't include them on the graph because they didn't have any hard figures. But they have a target of being carbon neutral pretty soon, I think by 2030, and then carbon negative by 2050 or something like that. And another, just as an aside, one interesting thing that a lot of these reports talked about was that the digitization of the games business was actually driving their emissions profile lower. But I think this is maybe just an accounting trick, and it sort of shifts a lot of these emissions to other locations like data centers and other companies that are then kind of responsible for them. So wrapping up, just a couple of quick conclusions. Development emissions are just one small part of a much bigger challenge, which is the carbon neutral games industry and bringing that about. But what I think is important in this area is signaling that this is the direction the industry is heading, and I think game development can kind of have a pretty important role in that. And obviously, the huge 100-pound gorilla in the room is business travel, which is a massive part of overall emissions and actually represents a tougher decarbonization challenge because we don't have kind of renewable planes. Like that's not even a technology on the horizon yet. So while things like data centers and consoles and things like that can be powered renewably or can be powered sustainably, travel, for the most part at the moment, is really resistant to decarbonization. Thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of it.